My friends, I want to tell you something today that I was too afraid to admit for almost 50 years of my life. For most of my adult years, I believed that if I could just earn the approval of my family, my parents, my children, my brothers and sisters, the people whose opinions shaped me since I was a small child, then I would finally feel whole. I thought their approval was the missing piece. I thought if they were proud of me, if they agreed with my choices, if they never looked at me with disappointment in their eyes, then peace would follow naturally, like sunlight after a long rain. I spent decades chasing that feeling. I made choices to please people who are no longer here to see them. I stayed quiet in rooms where I should have spoken. I said yes when my whole body was screaming no. And I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only gift worth giving at this point in my life. I got much of what I was chasing. I earned nods of approval. I earned proud smiles at gatherings. I earned the words, "We are so proud of you," more times than I can count. And still, something in me stayed empty. It was not until I turned 75 years old, sitting alone in my kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, that I finally understood the truth I had been avoiding my whole life. Family approval was never the thing that was missing. It was never going to be the thing that filled me. I had built my entire identity on a foundation that could shift with someone else's mood, someone else's expectations, someone else's unspoken standards, and a house built on shifting ground can never truly stand. So today, I want to share with you what I discovered instead. Not because I want you to abandon your family, and not because I believe approval from the people we love is worthless, it isn't. But because I spent too many years mistaking approval for love, mistaking agreement for connection, and mistaking silence for peace. I want to walk you through the lessons that took me a lifetime to learn, in the hope that you will not need 75 years to learn them yourself. You do not need to accept every lesson I share today. Take what speaks to your heart and set aside what does not. This is not a formula. It is simply one old man's honest reckoning with a life spent looking for approval in the wrong places, and finally, in his later years, finding something far more lasting. The first thing I understood was that approval and love are not the same thing. For most of my life, I confused the two. I believed that if someone approved of my choices, it meant they loved me, and if they disapproved, it meant their love had shrunk. But love does not shrink because someone disagrees with you. Real love can hold disappointment and devotion in the same hand. It took me 75 years to realize that some of the people who loved me most were also the people who understood me least, and that this was not a contradiction. It was simply what it means to be human, loving other humans who see the world differently than we do. The second thing I understood was that I had spent my life performing for an audience that was not actually watching as closely as I imagined. I used to lie awake replaying conversations, wondering if my father was disappointed in my choice of career, wondering if my siblings judged the way I raised my children. But when I finally asked them, honestly and directly, in my 70s, I discovered something humbling. Most of them had not been keeping score the way I had. They were busy living their own lives, carrying their own private worries. I had spent decades performing for an audience that had mostly moved on to their own concerns long ago. The third thing I understood was that seeking approval had quietly cost me my own voice. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking myself what I believed and started only asking what would be acceptable to say out loud. I edited my opinions before I spoke them. I softened my truths until they matched what I thought others wanted to hear. And slowly, without noticing, I lost track of what I actually thought about anything. It was only in my 70s, when I began writing my private thoughts down without an audience in mind, that I rediscovered a voice I barely recognized as my own. The fourth thing I understood was that I had confused peace with the absence of conflict. For years, I believed that if there was no argument, no tension, no raised voice at the dinner table, then everything was fine. So I avoided disagreement at any cost. I swallowed my frustrations. I nodded along to keep the peace. But that was never peace. It was only the postponement of honesty. Real peace, I learned much later, sometimes requires a difficult conversation before it can arrive. You cannot skip the storm and still expect clear skies. The fifth thing I understood was that approval is a moving target that can never be caught. No matter how much I achieved, no matter how many milestones I reached that I believed would finally satisfy my family's expectations, there was always a new standard waiting just beyond it. Finish school, and now find a stable job. Find a job, and now get married. Get married, and now have children. Have children, and now raise them a certain way. I finally understood that if I kept running toward approval, I would spend my entire life running and never once arrive. The sixth thing I understood was that self-respect had to come before anyone else's opinion of me, not after it. For most of my life, I put things in the wrong order. I waited for others to respect my choices before I allowed myself to respect them. But self-respect that depends on external permission is not self-respect at all. It is simply borrowed confidence, and borrowed things must eventually be returned. Somewhere in my 70s, I finally gave myself permission to respect my own decisions first, regardless of who agreed. The seventh thing I understood was that many of my family's expectations were never really about me. They were about their own fears, their own unlived dreams, their own experiences of a different generation trying to make sense of a changing world. When my mother once told me she wished I had chosen a more traditional path, I used to hear it as judgment of who I was. Later in life, I understood it was more about her own fear of the unfamiliar than any true assessment of my worth. Once I saw this clearly, I stopped taking every disapproving word so personally. The eighth thing I understood was that I had been mistaking obligation for devotion. I did many things throughout my life out of a heavy sense of duty rather than genuine desire, and I called it love because that felt like a kinder word than resentment. But obligation performed without any real willingness slowly hollows a person out. True devotion, I came to understand, is freely given. It does not need to be extracted through guilt or expectation. When I finally began choosing my actions from love instead of obligation, the same actions felt entirely different, lighter, sincere, mine. The ninth thing I understood was that I could love my family deeply without needing them to understand every part of me. For years I believed that being truly known by my family was the ultimate proof of connection. But some parts of us are not meant to be fully understood by everyone we love, and that does not make the love smaller. My children do not need to understand every decision I have made to still be my beloved children. I do not need my siblings to understand every belief I hold to still cherish our bond. Being loved and being fully understood are two separate gifts, and I finally stopped expecting one to always come with the other. The 10th thing I understood was that my worth was never actually up for a vote. I spent so many years unconsciously treating my family's opinions like a jury deciding whether I deserve to feel good about myself. But worth is not something that can be granted or withheld by any panel of people, however beloved. I was worthy the day I was born, long before anyone had formed an opinion about how I lived. Understanding this at 75 felt like putting down a heavy stone I did not even realize I had been carrying my entire life. The 11th thing I understood was that silence in the name of harmony often creates distance instead of closeness. For decades, I believed that staying quiet about my true feelings was an act of love, a way of protecting the peace within my family. But silence built walls I did not intend to build. My children grew up not truly knowing their father's inner world, because I had spent so many years hiding it to avoid disapproval. It was only in my later years, when I began speaking honestly about my fears, my regrets, and my true feelings, that my relationships finally deepened into something real. The 12th thing I understood was that comparison to my siblings had quietly poisoned decades of my life. I measured my success against my brother's career, my sister's marriage, my cousin's children, always searching for where I stood in some invisible family ranking. But every one of us was carrying a different set of circumstances, a different set of struggles nobody else could fully see. Once I let go of the scoreboard entirely, I found I finally had room to simply enjoy my family instead of quietly competing with them. The 13th thing I understood was that forgiveness was something I needed to offer myself as much as I offered it to others. For years, I carried resentment toward family members who had hurt me, and I also carried guilt for the times I had hurt them. I discovered, quite late in life, that forgiveness is not a single act performed once. It is a practice, repeated as many times as old wounds resurface. And the hardest forgiveness of all was not forgiving my parents for their mistakes. It was forgiving myself for the years I spent believing I was not enough because of how they raised me. The 14th thing I understood was that I had spent too many years protecting my family's image instead of protecting the truth. I stayed silent about painful family history because I did not want to appear disloyal. I smoothed over difficult truths in conversations with friends because I did not want anyone to think less of the people I loved. But protecting an image is exhausting work, and it is work that never actually heals anything. Real healing required me to finally speak honestly, even when the truth was not flattering to anyone, including myself. The 15th thing I understood was that the approval I sought from my parents could never be given by anyone else, not even by them, if they themselves never learn how to give it. Some of my relatives were raised in generations where affirmation was rare, where love was shown through providing rather than through words. I spent years waiting for a kind of verbal approval that some of my elders simply did not know how to offer, not because they did not love me, but because nobody had ever taught them the language. Understanding this freed me from a weight that could have lasted my entire lifetime. The 16th thing I understood was that my children's choices were never a reflection of my worth as a parent. For years, I quietly tied my own sense of success to whether my children's lives matched the picture I had imagined for them. When their paths diverged from what I expected, I felt it as a personal failure. But children are not extensions of us. They are separate, whole human beings with their own journeys to walk. Once I released my grip on their choices, I discovered I could finally enjoy watching them become who they truly are. The 17th thing I understood was that peace within myself had to come before peace within my family, not the other way around. I used to believe that if my family finally got along perfectly, if every relationship was smooth, then I would feel settled inside. But I had this backwards. Trying to manage everyone else's harmony while neglecting my own inner peace left me anxious and depleted. Once I began tending to my own peace first, I found I brought a calmer presence into every family gathering, and that calm, more than any effort to control the outcome, is what slowly softened many old tensions. The 18th thing I understood was that some family relationships change shape, and that this is not always a tragedy. I used to believe that closeness, once established, should remain exactly the same forever, and any distance that developed meant something had gone wrong. But people grow, circumstances shift, and some relationships naturally loosen while others tighten in their place. Learning to accept the changing shape of my family relationships, rather than mourning that they were not frozen in an earlier form, brought me a surprising amount of relief. The 19th thing I understood was that gratitude for my family had to exist separately from needing their approval. For a long time, these two things were tangled together in my mind. I felt grateful for my family mostly in the moments they approved of me, and resentful in the moments they did not. Slowly, I learned to feel gratitude simply for their presence in my life, independent of whether they agreed with my choices that week. This separation allowed me to appreciate my family far more freely, without the constant undertone of anxious hope for their validation. The 20th thing I understood was that true connection requires being seen, not merely being accepted. For years, I settled for being accepted, tolerated, included, spoken kindly to, and I called that connection. But being accepted and being truly seen are very different experiences. Being seen means someone recognizes your true self, your fears, your joys, your private thoughts, and stays close anyway. It was only when I began sharing my authentic self, rather than the polished version I thought would earn approval, that I finally experienced the deeper connection I had been quietly starving for all along. The 21st thing I understood was that I had been afraid of my family's disappointment more than I had been afraid of my own regret. For most of my life, disappointing someone I loved felt like the worst possible outcome. But in my 70s, looking back over decades of choices, I realized the moments I regret most are not the times I disappointed someone else. They are the times I disappointed myself by not speaking my truth, not pursuing what mattered to me, not honoring my own life in order to avoid another person's frown. Regret, I learned, is a far heavier burden than disappointment ever was. The 22nd thing I understood was that legacy is not the same as being remembered fondly by everyone. I used to think that leaving behind a good legacy meant leaving behind a spotless reputation within my family, one where nobody had a single complaint about me. But legacy, I now believe, is not the absence of complaints. It is the presence of honesty, warmth, and growth that others can point to and say, this person tried, this person grew, this person was real with us. A legacy built on flawless approval is a fragile, hollow thing. A legacy built on authentic presence endures. The 23rd thing I understood was that I could set boundaries with my family and still love them completely. For years, boundaries felt like a betrayal to me, as though loving someone meant giving them unlimited access to my time, my energy, and my compliance. But I learned, later than I would like to admit, that boundaries are not walls against love. They are the structure that allows love to be sustainable rather than draining. Saying no to certain demands from my family did not diminish my love for them. It simply protected enough of myself that I still had something real left to give. The 24th thing I understood was that what truly matters cannot be inherited or approved into existence. It has to be lived. I spent so many years hoping that if I gathered enough approval, enough recognition, enough proof that I had done things right, meaning would simply arrive as a reward. But meaning was never something waiting at the end of approval's road. It was built quietly, through the ordinary moments I almost missed while I was busy seeking permission to feel good about my life. A walk at sunrise, an honest conversation, a moment of genuine laughter with someone I love, a quiet evening where I finally felt at peace with exactly who I had become. The 25th thing I understood was that I had spent years treating my family's silence as a verdict, when often it was simply silence. If my mother did not comment on a decision I made, I assumed disapproval. If my brother did not call to celebrate an achievement, I assumed indifference. But I have learned that silence carries no single meaning. Sometimes it is distraction. Sometimes it is a person's own struggle with words. Sometimes it is simply the ordinary quiet of a busy life. I had spent years interpreting empty space as rejection, filling it with the worst possible story, when the truth was usually far simpler and far less personal than I imagined. The 26th thing I understood was that I could disagree with my family's beliefs and still belong to the family completely. For a long time, I believed that belonging required agreement, that to truly be part of the family, I had to hold the same views, follow the same traditions, and see the world through the same lens as everyone else at the table. But belonging, I came to understand, is not a matter of matching opinions. It is a matter of shared history, shared love, and a willingness to remain at the table even when we see things differently. Some of my most important growth came from beliefs my family did not share, and I no longer feel that this growth made me any less theirs. The 27th thing I understood was that I had been outsourcing my sense of success to people who were measuring it by an old and outdated ruler. My parents grew up in a different time, with different definitions of what a good life looked like. For years, I measured my choices against their ruler, even when the world I was living in had changed entirely. It took me a long time to realize that their definition of success, however lovingly intended, was built for a different era, and that I was allowed to build my own ruler, one that actually measured a life I recognized as mine. The 28th thing I understood was that grief and gratitude can exist in the same breath. As I grew older, I lost people from my family, one by one, and with each loss came a strange mixture of sorrow and appreciation I did not know how to hold at first. I used to think I had to choose between mourning what was gone and being thankful for what I had. But grief and gratitude are not opposites. They are companions. Learning to let both live inside me at once, without needing to resolve the tension between them, brought me a peace I had not expected grief to ever allow. The 29th thing I understood was that I had been waiting for an apology that might never come, and that my peace could not depend on it. There were wounds from my childhood that I quietly hoped, for decades, someone in my family would eventually acknowledge and apologize for. Some of those apologies came. Many never did. I finally understood that if my healing depended entirely on someone else's willingness to say the words I needed to hear, I might wait for the rest of my life. So I learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to release the wound without requiring the apology, not because the harm did not matter, but because my peace mattered more than my waiting. The 30th thing I understood was that the version of me my family remembers is not always the version I have become. Sometimes, at family gatherings, I noticed relatives still speaking to me as though I were the anxious young man I was 40 years ago, still expecting the old reactions, still bracing for the old arguments. For a while, this frustrated me deeply. Later, I understood that people often carry old snapshots of us in their minds, simply because that is the version they knew longest. I stopped needing them to instantly update their picture of me, and instead let my calm, consistent presence slowly repaint it over time. The 31st thing I understood was that some family members will never fully change, and that my peace cannot wait for them to. I spent years hoping a difficult relative would eventually soften, eventually apologize, eventually become the person I needed them to be. Some people do change. Others, despite our hopes, remain exactly as they have always been. I finally understood that I could love someone, keep appropriate distance from their harm, and still build a full and peaceful life, without needing their transformation as a prerequisite for my own. The 32nd thing I understood was that presence matters more than perfection in every family relationship I have ever valued. I do not remember my grandfather for any flawless wisdom he offered me. I remember him for simply being there, for the quiet afternoons, for his steady hands, for the fact that he showed up, again and again, without needing to be extraordinary. I understood, far later than I wish, that my own family did not need me to be a perfect example. They needed me present, attentive, and willing to keep showing up through the ordinary, unremarkable days that make up most of a life. The 33rd thing I understood was that my worth to my family was never actually in question, only my belief in it. Looking back honestly, I can see now that my family loved me through most of my uncertainty, even when I could not feel it. The doubt was not coming from them nearly as often as it was coming from inside me. I had spent years defending myself against a judgment that was mostly my own harsh imagination, dressed up in the voices of people who, in truth, were far gentler toward me than I had been toward myself. The 34th thing I understood was that peace with my family and peace with myself are two separate journeys, and I could no longer wait for one to finish before starting the other. For most of my life, I postponed my own inner peace, telling myself I would feel settled once every family relationship was smooth and resolved. But some relationships take a lifetime to soften, and some never fully do. I finally understood that I did not have to wait for my family's journey to conclude before beginning my own. I could tend my inner peace starting today, regardless of where anyone else in my family stood on their own path. The 35th thing I understood was that I had confused keeping the family together with keeping myself small. For years, I believed that my role was to be the quiet, agreeable one, the peacekeeper who never rocked the boat, because I thought this was what held everyone together. But a family held together only by one person's constant self-erasure is not truly stable. It is simply quiet on the surface. When I finally began speaking my full opinions, even the uncomfortable ones, our family did not fall apart as I had feared. It became more honest instead, And honest things, I learned, tend to last far longer than quiet, fragile ones. The 36th thing I understood was that comparing my family to an idealized image I saw elsewhere had quietly poisoned my appreciation for the family I actually had. I used to watch other families at gatherings, in old films, in the stories people told, and measure my own against a warmth I imagined they possessed effortlessly. But every family, I eventually learned, carries its own private struggles behind the smiling photographs. Once I stopped comparing my real, imperfect family to an imagined ideal, I found I could finally see the specific, ordinary warmth that had been there all along, waiting for me to notice it without the fog of comparison in the way. The 37th thing I understood was that I owed my children honesty about my own struggles, not just my strength. For years, I believed a good father showed only steadiness, only certainty, only strength, because I thought this was what my children needed from me. But hiding my doubts and my fears from them did not make me appear stronger. It only taught them to hide their own. Later in life, when I began sharing my genuine uncertainties with my children, something shifted between us. They no longer needed to perform confidence they did not feel either, and our relationship became a place where truth, not just strength, was welcome. The 38th thing I understood was that time spent waiting for the right moment to reconcile is time that can quietly run out. I lost a cousin I had been estranged from for many years, always believing there would eventually be a better time to reach out and repair what had broken between us. That better time never arrived, because he passed before I found the courage to call. This loss taught me, more sharply than any lesson before it, that reconciliation delayed indefinitely is reconciliation that may simply never happen. I began, after that, to reach out sooner rather than waiting for a perfect moment that time does not promise any of us. The 39th thing I understood was that I could honor my parents' memory without repeating every belief they held. After my parents passed, I felt a strange guilt whenever I made choices that differed from the values they had taught me, as though changing my mind about something was a betrayal of their memory. But honoring someone does not require freezing yourself into their exact image forever. I came to believe that carrying forward their love, their sacrifices, and their good intentions, while still allowing my own understanding to grow beyond theirs, is not betrayal. It is simply what it means to keep learning after the people who taught us are gone. The 40th thing I understood was that the quiet moments, not the milestone gatherings, were where my family's true bond was built. For years, I placed enormous importance on holidays, big celebrations, and major milestones, believing these were the moments that defined our closeness as a family. But looking back over 75 years, the memories that warm me most are rarely the grand occasions. They are the ordinary Tuesday phone calls, the unremarkable car rides, the quiet cups of coffee shared without any agenda at all. I learned, later than I would like, that true closeness is built in the small, uncelebrated moments far more than in the ones we photograph. And the 41st thing, the final lesson I want to leave you with today, is this: what truly matters is your relationship with your own conscience, not your family's applause. At 75, sitting with my cold cup of tea that ordinary Tuesday morning, I finally asked myself a question I had avoided my whole life. Not would my family approve of this, but can I live with myself for this? That single shift in the question I asked changed everything that came after it. It did not make me love my family any less. If anything, it made my love for them more honest, because it was no longer built on the exhausting hope of their permission. It was simply love, offered freely, asking nothing in return. My friends, I do not tell you any of this to suggest that family does not matter. Family matters enormously. The people who raised us, who shaped us, who sat across the table from us through every season of life, they matter more than most of us realize until time has taken some of them from us. But their approval was never meant to be the foundation of our peace. It was only ever meant to be one part of a much larger life, a life that also required our own honesty, our own courage, and our own quiet reckoning with who we truly are. I think of my own father often now, more than I did when he was alive. I spent so many years wondering whether he was proud of me that I rarely stopped to simply be present with him, to ask him about his own fears, his own regrets, his own unfinished dreams. By the time I finally understood that his approval was never the point, he was gone, and I could no longer ask him the questions I wish I had asked. I share this not to burden you with my own regret, but because I do not want you to arrive at 75, as I did, wishing you had asked different questions while there was still time to ask them. If you are watching this today and you feel like you have spent years, perhaps even decades, seeking a kind of approval that never quite arrives, I want you to hear this from someone who understands exactly what that feels like. It is not too late to ask yourself the better question. It is not too late to build your peace on steadier ground. You do not need 75 years to learn what I learned. You only need the willingness to stop waiting for permission and start living honestly, today, in this very ordinary moment. And if there is someone in your family you have been waiting to reconcile with, someone you have been meaning to call, someone you have been holding at a careful distance while you waited for the right moment, I would gently ask you not to wait as long as I did. Time is the one thing none of us can ask for more of. The approval we sought so desperately in our younger years often mattered far less than the simple, ordinary act of picking up the phone and saying, "I love you," while there is still time to say it and still time to hear it said back. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared brings you a little more clarity, a little more courage, and a little more peace with exactly who you are. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Be honest with your hearts. Love your families deeply, but build your peace on something steadier than their approval. Build it on your own quiet, unshakable relationship with yourself. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay honest, stay peaceful, and remember, it is never too late to finally understand what truly matters. Thank you for watching.